The right atrium, right? Rough anterior part was coming from the atrial chamber proper. The smooth posterior part was derived from the absorption of right horn of sinus venosus and the interatrial septum. Demarcating part is the crista terminalis. The left atrium, the rough part, was again by atrial chamber proper, and the smooth part, the absorption of pulmonary vein in the left atrium and absorption of right horn of sinus venosus in right atrium, interatrial septum in both. Right? You can see this is the sinus venosus. Right? You can see the developing atrium over here, and here it goes backwards. Now, the right ventricle, the rough part, the proximal portion of the bulbous cordis, the smooth part, the conus cordis, or the middle portion of the bulbous cordis. Where the left ventricle, rough part, whole of the primitive ventricular chamber, the conus cordis or the middle portion of the bulbous cordis forms the smooth part, like in case of the right ventricle also. So both the smooth part of both the ventricle derive from the conus cordis or middle portion of the bulbous cordis, whereas the rough part of right ventricle from the proximal portion of the bulbous cordis and the rough part of the left ventricle from the primitive ventricular chamber. Now the interarterial septum. Septum primum gives rise to the fossa ovalis, whereas septum secundum the limbus fossa ovalis. Interventricular septum. It is thick muscular and lower part by the two ventricles. Thin membranous part in the upper part by the fusion of the inferior atrioventricular cushion, the right and the left conus swelling. Membranous part not only separates the two ventricles but also separates the right atrium from the left ventricle. Truncus arteriosus here, or the distal part of the bulbous cordis, forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk, as separated by the spiral septum over here. The spiral septum is responsible for the triple relation of the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Now, what is this triple relation? At the beginning, the pulmonary trunk is anterior to the ascending aorta, then it turns to the left, and finally then it is to the left, and then finally the right pulmonary artery lies posterior to the ascending aorta. Heart is fully functional at the end of the second month of intrauterine life. Molecular regulation. The genes involved in cardiac development are Nuremberg and Kim2 homeobox 5. This is the master gene regulating the development of the heart and the neural crest derivatives, hand 1 and hand 2. What other genes involved in development of the ventricles? Signaling molecules involved are bone morphogenic proteins BMP2 and 4 secreted by the endoderm and the lateral plate mesoderm, which induce the heart-forming region of the splanchnic mesoderm. Crescent and Severus produced by endodermal cells inhibit WNT proteins 3A and 8 secreted by the neural tube, which inhibit the heart development. Thus, the cardiac development proceeds uninhibited. Cardiac looping is dependent on left T2, and TBX is important for separation. Fetal circulation. The fetus is dependent on its mother for entire nutrition, and which is achieved via the placenta attached to the uterus. As the lungs are not functioning, the blood needs to bypass the pulmonary circuit. Fetal circulation. The oxygenated blood reaches the fetus via the single umbilical vein by the single umbilical vein. This vein contains oxygenated blood, traverses the umbilical cord over here to reach the liver, after which the oxygenated blood bypasses the liver via the ductus venosus. This is the ductus venosus to join the inferior vena cava over here. This is the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava drains into the right atrium. The oxygenated and the nutrient-rich blood enters the right atrium, after which it passes into the left atrium via the foramen veil, bypassing the pulmonary circuit. In the left atrium, it enters the left ventricle and traverses the systemic circulation via the ascending aorta, the arch of aorta, and the descending thoracic and the descending abdominal aorta. Last mentioned vessels divide into the common iliac arteries. Each common iliac artery terminates by dividing into external and internal iliac artery. Arising from the two internal iliac artery are the two umbilical arteries, which in turn pass through the umbilical cord to enter into the placenta. The deoxygenated blood from the viscera, the lower limb, the head and neck, and upper limb also enter the right atrium via both inferior and superior vena cava. This venous blood gains entry into the right ventricle and leaves via the pulmonary trunk and the left pulmonary artery. The left pulmonary artery is joined to the left end of the arch of aorta via the ductus arteriosus. Thus, venous blood traversing through the left pulmonary artery and the ductus arteriosus enters the left end of the arch of aorta. So, the descending thoracic and the abdominal aorta gets mixed blood. At the internal iliac end, it passes via the two umbilical arteries to reach the placenta for oxygenation. So, for bypassing the lungs and for providing oxygen and nutrition to the developing embryo and the fetus, the following structures have to be improvised. One umbilical vein, ductus venosus, foramen veil, ductus arteriosus, and the two umbilical arteries. At the time of birth, with the start of the breathing process, all these structures retrogress and gradually the adult form of circulation takes place. The changes occurring at birth: umbilical vein forms the ligamentum teres hepaticus. Ductus venosus forms ligamentum venosum. The foramen ovale closes. The ductus arteriosus forms the ligamentum arteriosum. The umbilical arteries form the medial umbilical ligaments. Lungs starts to function. The placenta is delivered and removed. Right. So, what is the atrial septal defect? Normally, the septum primum fuses with the septum secundum to obliterate the interarterial foramen. Incomplete fusion of the two septa leads to atrial septal defect or the ASD. What is a ventricular septal defect? Ventricular septal defect is due to the defect in the formation of the membranous part of the intraventricular foramen. This septum is formed by the right and the left bulbar ridges and proliferating posterior endocardial cushion. Improper fusion of these three leads to ventricular septal defect. The membranous part of the interventricular septum is of neural crest origin. Phallocetrology. The components of phallocetrology are patent interventricular foramen here, overriding of aorta, it is overriding in front, pulmonic stenosis, this is pulmonic stenosis, you can see overriding of aorta, and right ventricular hypertrophy. That's all about the clinical anatomy of embryological aspect of heart development.